God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kind, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. I like that. That's... You see, it's interesting, these old pictures, eh? Because if you look here, you got this halo around God's head, and you've got this split again between night and darkness, and God's right on the border between the two. And that's the sun, right? That's what a halo is. A halo is the sun, or the moon. Sometimes it's like a coin. You know, you have the queen's head on the coin, and that's the queen on the moon, and it's silver, and it's a symbol of value, because of course the queen is sovereign, and the moon is the sovereign of the night sky, and gold, of course, is the sun, and gold is pure because it doesn't mix with other metals, and it shines like the sun, so it partakes of the sun, and God partakes of the sun because there's something about whatever he represents that's associated with consciousness and illumination and enlightenment, and it's that force of illumination and enlightenment that's right on the border between these two sets of phenomena, and that's kind of what that picture is trying to present. And so, you know, it's a metaphor, that's one way of thinking about it, but it does, again, allude to the underlying idea that there's something about consciousness that's integral to being itself. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and for years. I mean, that's a remarkable bit of writing there too, because you just think about how bloody long it took our caveman ancestors to look at the night sky and start to figure out that there were repeating patterns across years that enabled them to mark the seasons. I mean, I just can't imagine how they figured that out. It's the degree of careful observation that it took. And I mean, we know people figured that out a long time ago, because you know, those great megalithic monuments like Stonehenge seem to be astronomical observatories, essentially, and you see the same thing with the pyramids. I mean, people were looking at the damn sky, trying to figure out, looking at God, you know, because that's kind of what you're doing when you're looking at the night sky, trying to figure out the regularity and order in the universe, and that's all compacted into this little line, you know, and let them be for signs and for seasons, to be oriented by the stars. Amazing. And then let them be lights in the expanse of heavens to give light upon the earth, and it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night. And so there's an idea of sovereignty there too, right? That there's an analogy between the ruler and the heavenly bodies that light up the darkness, essentially. And that's a really interesting idea too, because it took us a long time to come to terms with, as I mentioned last week, to come to terms with the idea of sovereignty itself, and to decide what constituted valid power. And it's not power. It's not power. It's authority and competence, and not power. It's not dominance either. It's more sophisticated than that, because the people that you want to rule aren't people who have power, because power just means I can hurt you and you can't hurt me back. That's not what you need from a ruler, even though it devolves into that from time to time. What you want is the kind of wisdom that illuminates the darkness, and to associate the sovereign with the heavenly kings of the light is a perfectly reasonable thing to do from a metaphoric perspective. And that's an ancient idea, you know, and another example of how we're grounded in a dream. And God set them in the expanse of heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Another emphasis on the fact that it was better that there was something than nothing. And you know, maybe you could consider that the declaration of the cosmos is something like, well, it's better that there's something than nothing. And well, how do you know that? And I guess the answer to that is that there's something instead of nothing. And I know that that's not proof, but it's still a remarkable fact that it happens to be the case, and no one does know why that is. And so maybe we should go along with it and see what we can do with it, you know, and see how we could make it better, because we certainly could if we were really committed to it, and we shook our resentment and our anger and our hatred. And I know there's reason for all of that, because people do suffer terribly, but you know, God only knows what being could be like if we all contributed to it to the best of our ability. God only knows what we could conquer, and what sort of magnificent cities we could produce, and what things we could we could eradicate from the suffering of the world. And there was, there's this guy I read about, this is amazing, and I don't remember his name, but he found out about this worm that was called the guinea worm. And guinea worm is a really horrible thing, and you can look it up if you want, but I'll tell you a little bit about it, even though it's very distasteful. So a guinea worm is a parasite that lives in Africa, and it burrows under your skin, and it's quite long. It's about that long, and it's, about that wide, and so it'll burrow underneath your leg, and then it's in there, and maybe it pokes its little head out a hole, which is one of its delightful tendencies. And then if you want to pull it out, it breaks, right? Obviously, because otherwise you just pull it out and it would be dead, and so it doesn't like that, so it just breaks off. And many people had this horrible disease, and well, you can't imagine what that would be like, because you're part of the 1% and you live in North America, and thank God for that. But just a little you don't even want to think about it, let alone have it. And he went to Africa and wiped the damn thing out. It's like, well, great, it seems to me the planet's a lot better off without any guinea worms on it. Even though that's like guinea worm genocide talk, I'm still, pretty happy about it. And so that was one guy who thought, well, we don't need these things. And yeah, well, fair enough, and yeah, well, so good for him. Like, he can die thinking that the world's a better place than it was when he first popped out, and so good for that. I think that's a good aim, I think, is to think that when you're on your deathbed, and you can look back and think, well, there's a little less suffering in the world from here on out than there would be if I had never existed. And that's a lot better than the opposite, because it's certainly possible, say, if you're Stalin, to ensure that there's a hell of a lot more suffering in the world than there would have been if you hadn't lived. And we perfectly well know that people can manage that, and that many people try to do nothing but manage precisely that. So, and it's hard for me not to think about that as some sort of metaphysical evil, and I think it's the right way to look at it. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So you have the sun here, and then the moon here, as far as I can tell. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I think this is the moon over here, but so, yeah, and that's part of the Sistine Chapel, which is, an absolutely remarkable. No, part of the reason too, and part of the reason I'm teaching about these biblical stories is because, I'm thinking, because the humanities have been decimated so badly, and again, I think that has mostly to do with resentment and hatred more than anything else, but I don't really think that you can get a grip on the humanities and what they have to offer without knowing the biblical stories, because they're the dream out of which the humanities emerge. And so unless you have that background knowledge, that dream, then there's all sorts of things that are utterly profound that don't open themselves up to you. And Dante's Inferno would be one of those, and Milton's Paradise Lost, which is an absolutely amazing piece of work. I mean, Milton wrote it because he wanted to justify the ways of God to man. What an ambition that is. And I mean, he was serious about that. He took the problem seriously. It's like, it's the Mephistophelian problem, is that, well, this is a rough business that we're involved in, and, maybe we should just give it up. And I think the whole world, I think, was deciding that in the 1980s, when we were deciding whether we were going to engage in the ultimate nuclear catastrophe, and we were very, very close to that a number of times. And I think it was a collective decision in some sense on the part of humanity that we might as well keep the whole awful game going rather than just demolish it. But Milton, he wrote Paradise Lost it's a dream, again, it's a dream, and trying to explain the nature of being and the nature of evil, and you can't crack the damn thing without knowing the underlying stories, and that's really too bad, because it's utterly profound. And the reason you need profound things, as far as I can tell, you need profound knowledge, is because life is actually a profound problem for everyone. I mean, you can shelter back and live a very conservative existence, and look, like, more power to you. I understand why you would do that, but it doesn't stop you from having to face the ultimate questions of life. They're right there in everyone's face, and at least at some point in your life. And it would be better if you could, I think, if you could confront them full on and to deal with them properly and to be a beacon of strength as a consequence of that. And I think that wisdom, that's what the humanities are supposed to teach, is wisdom. And wisdom is what enables you to deal honorably with the tragedy of life. And I can't see how you could think that that was a bad idea, because there are going to be times when you're in an emergency room and prone to panic and to cry and to break down and to collapse and to be of no use to anyone around you. And that's not the right way to be. It's the right way to be in a situation like that is to be strong and reliable, and I don't think you can do that without being wise, and you can't be wise without putting yourself together and without knowing something about where you came from and what you're like, and that's history and the humanities. And so this isn't optional. It's more necessary. The man does not live by bread alone, and that's exactly the issue here. So you see these magnificent works, I mean, it's not like Michelangelo thought of this literally, he was a genius for God's sake, and he's trying to get at something, and he's trying to get at the profundity of human culture. I suppose that's why you have this patriarchal figure here, and the cosmic role that consciousness and tradition plays in being itself, and it's ennobling. And you think people, religious or not, people, hundreds of millions of people come from all over the world to Rome and go through this little tiny chapel to look at this. There's something in it that everyone needs to see. It's not just beauty, it's more than beauty. It's that which feeds the soul. And everyone feels that, even if they can't explain it. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. Kind, right? That's kin, right? And to be kind is to treat others as if they're your kin. And so, according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. That's continually represented over and over. God said, that's the thing that calls being into existence. And God said it was good, and that's the fundamental judgment about the nature of reality. And, one of the things that happens in the translation, in the movement, let's say, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, is God is obviously blessing creation in the beginning of this story. And then you have Old Testament God, and don't mess around with him, right? Because he'll give you good smiting if you get out of line. There's no doubt about that. And he's kind of an arbitrary character. And, lots of modern people think, well, how could you believe in a God like that? And it's like, when I read that, I think, well, the Old Testament people, that isn't how they thought. They thought, you better look the hell out, because life is really difficult, and if you step out of line, you're going to get flattened, and God doesn't care, in some sense, whether you approve of him. It's like, what the hell does that have to do with anything? Obviously you don't approve. It's like, you better pay attention though, because otherwise you're going to be in real trouble. And there's real wisdom in that. Nietzsche really admired the Old Testament as a work of literature, because he thought that the representation of the divine, let's say, as a representation of the essential nature of being was extraordinarily accurate in its arbitrary and often cruel nature. It wasn't following a morality that human beings could really understand as moral. But he thought that was very realistic, and I like that interpretation. But what happens in the New Testament is quite interesting, because there's an insistence all of a sudden in the New Testament that you're supposed to act towards God as if he's nothing but good. And that's such a strange thing, because you look at the world and you think, yeah, really? Just good, eh? Well, the cancer and the earthquakes is kind of hard to fit into that picture. And, the terrible things that happen to children and all of that is very difficult to square with the notion of a good God, obviously. But then the underlying idea is that if you act in that manner, it makes it more likely to be true. It's something like that. And so I would consider that in some sense an act of both courage and faith. It's like you're going to make the case, like God makes at the beginning of the Bible, that being is in fact good. Now, you can't see it because, well, you get to see all the things about it that aren't so good. That's not the point. It's a metaphysical presupposition, something like that. It's a decision to act that way. I'm going to act as if being is good, and to further that. And then the implicit idea is, well, there isn't any way that you can make things work out better than to do that. And so there's a courageous element to it, which I think is also expressed to some degree in the idea of Christ's like voluntary sacrifice of his own life. His presupposition was something like, I'm going to act as if God is good, and I'm going to play that out right to the end. And now that becomes something like a divine pattern. And I believe there's wisdom in that, because again, most of the time that I've been wrestling with this sort of thing, I've always been looking at the opposite. I haven't been studying good, I've been studying evil. Because evil is easier to believe, especially after the 20th century. It's like, I think you have to be blind not to think about the things that happened in the 20th century as evil. And some of the things that happened were so brutal, it's just absolutely unimaginable. And, well, unless you imagine it. And it's right there, it's part of the historical record. And then I think, well, if there's something that's that terrible, it indicates as clearly as anything can that there's also something that's its opposite, and that's whatever it is that's the farthest away possible from that outcome. Now, that doesn't mean we can exactly say what it is, because it's easier to grip, in some sense, what it means to torture and break and hurt, and not to be able to conceptualize so clearly how you would have to act if you were acting in the exact opposite manner. But at least it implies that it exists, and I see that pattern being laid out in this dreamlike manner in the New Testament, and it has something to do with, well, it has something to do, and this is for sure, with the voluntary acceptance of mortality. Because of course that's the poisoned apple, right? The fact that everybody looks forward into the future to know that you're finite, and so is everything that you love. And it's very difficult for that not to poison your existence. And well, there's no getting out of it, as far as we can tell, but there might be something like switching your attitude to it, and you could say, well, that's the price you pay for being. And the heroic thing to do is to accept that, and not even to accept it grudgingly. To say, all right, I'm going to go along with that, I'm going to accept that, and I'm going to act nonetheless as if being is good, and then I'm going to see how things turn out. It's something like that. And God saw that it was good. And so it's an act of courage. Right? There's an act of courage that's associated with that transformation of attitude. And even with regards to the notion that the world is good, it's a courageous attitude, especially given that there's so much evidence that makes that conclusion difficult to continually draw. But the alternative seems to me to be far worse. So there's God again with the sun behind him, because he's associated with the solar consciousness, and he's creating all these strange, wonderful creatures, and you know, and people say, well, you know, the idea of God as an old man in the sky, let's say, that's primitive. It's much more better to think about it as much more better? Jesus. Anyways, it's more sophisticated to think of the divine essence as a disembodied spirit or something like that. But you know, that's not so obvious either, because as I already pointed out, there isn't anything that's more complicated than a human being. And so the idea that the divine is something that's at least as complicated as a human being strikes me as something that's actually quite reasonable. And I know it's a metaphor, although I don't know to what degree it is a metaphor, and it's also something that's embodied. And that's also a very interesting notion, you know, because it's become increasingly obvious as we've tried to do such things as produce artificial intelligence, that it's very difficult to produce an intelligence or perhaps a consciousness that isn't embodied in some manner. It can't be just a spirit without form. And I think that's part of the reason too why Christianity puts so much emphasis at the end of time on the resurrection of the body, because there's a drive in there to ennoble the idea of the body, not just the spirit, the consciousness that floats abstractly above the body, but to say that, no, you can't do that. You can't just shed that part of you that's heavy and material, so to speak, and leave it behind as if it's of no value. You have to ennoble that as well. And that idea is also linked to the representation of God as a human being, and as a wise human being, and as something that's embodied. And so, at least from the metaphorical perspective, I don't think it's reasonable just to brush your hands across it and say, well, that's primitive. Because I don't think it is. I don't think it's primitive at all.